Hello and welcome to my build review of the dassault Rafale in 70-second scale by HobbyBoss. The first time I saw a Rafale was at an air show here in Austria. I was literally blown away by its maneuverability and design, so the Rafale became one of my favorite military aircraft. More than 5 years ago I built my first Rafale kit from Rafale. As you can see, I was not very experienced with scale modeling back then. In the meantime I built dozens of kits, so I thought I should give it another try. I already uploaded a detailed unboxing video of this HobbyBoss kit if you just want to see what's in the box. While the Rafale already looks great in its standard paint, there are also many special schemes that are just beautiful. Luckily I found this set of masks and decals from syhart. With this set you can recreate the solo display livery of 2017. The Rafale was my second entry to the special schemes and tigermeet group build, after my Frecce Tricolori MB339 from Italy. A detailed build review video can be found on my channel. In addition to the masks and decals, I bought a set of photo-etched parts from Eduard to add more detail to the cockpit. I had never used PE parts before, but overall it was much easier to use them than I thought it would be. As you can see, I used a wooden board with poster tack on it to cut the parts. The poster tack prevents the PE parts from getting lost. Some of them are very small, and so are the chances of finding it again if you lose one. Another use of the poster tack is to put it on a toothpick and hold the tiny parts with that. If you use tweezers, there is a big chance that the parts will fly all across the room. Anyways, I added the PE parts to the ejection seat. There are harnesses, belts, handles and other tiny details. A few of those parts also have to be bent, which was not a big deal. So when all parts were glued into place, I did some dry brushing to add highlights on the seat. After painting a few more details like oxygen bottles, I was satisfied with it and moved on. The instrument panel has several parts and 3 layers, which looks much better than just using decals. The only problem I saw was the color of these parts, as they had a bluish tint. Anyways, I glued the instrument panel to the upper fuselage. The PE set from Eduard also comes with a clear film for the head-up display, as you can see. I prepared the cockpit for the other PE parts by removing some of the material of the kit parts. The dials and switches also had to be sanded down. Again, some tiny PE parts had to be bent into shape, which required a lot of patience. I used super glue to glue them on and was already quite impressed. Most of the PE parts are not pre-painted, so I primed the cockpit and the parts with Mr. Finishing Surfacer. Then I painted it black and did some dry brushing with grey paint. As you can see, this brings out the details and makes the all-black cockpit less boring. Now I was able to glue the photo-etched instrument panels into place. They add a lot of detail with all the dials and switches, but I used the black wash to tone the blue tint down a bit. Next I masked off the clear parts using masking tape and liquid mask. The PE set also comes with parts for inside the clear parts. These panels and rear mirrors are a great addition. To mask off the cockpit I used wet kitchen paper and liquid mask along the edges. Now I was finally able to start the assembly of the Rafale. A few minor adjustments for the C version of the Rafale had to be done, for example the removal of an antenna on the vertical stabilizer. The manual doesn't tell you that, so do your research. Then I added the front gear bay and glued the fuselage together. I used clothes pegs to hold everything in place, while the glue was drying. The next steps were the air intakes and the engine nozzles. The nose was filled with poster tack to add a bit of weight. Unfortunately, the fit at the nose and air intakes wasn't good. I also had to improve the front gear bay, which was a bit misaligned. Therefore I scraped off some material and sanded it down. The same problem occurred at the dorsal spine. To fill the gaps I used milliput 2-part epoxy, protecting the surrounding areas with tape. Then I used the damp cotton bud to remove the excess and a fine grit sandpaper to get rid of any irregularities. The same process had to be done at the air intakes. Gap filling is my least favorite thing to do in modeling, but the more time you invest at this stage, the better the model will look in the end. After priming the Rafale with Mr. Finishing Surfacer, some areas looked really rough, so even more sanding was required. I have no idea what caused this, but it was definitely annoying. While I was already at it, I also invested more time into other areas. After another coat of primer I was satisfied, so it was time to start the painting process. Syhart provides a detailed painting guide for the Solo Display 2017 scheme. The first step was to paint the whole model in bright blue. As suggested by the manual, I used Tamiya's X4. This was my first use of Tamiya paint. After mixing it with Mr. Leveling Thinner, light coats were sprayed on and I was relatively satisfied with it. I wasn't so sure about the color tone though, but more on that later. Step 2 was the fun part, masking. Luckily the instructions were quite clear about the order and location in which you have to use the masks. What was problematic was the adhesiveness of the masks. As soon as I had placed the mask, the previously placed mask would already come off again. I don't want to go into detail too much here, but overall I almost lost my motivation with this whole masking process. However, I really wanted to pull this amazing scheme off. I tried to place the masks as precisely as possible and used masking tape around the edges of the Syhart masks. The good thing was that the edges of these painted areas would be covered with decals. Therefore my hope was that it would not be a big problem if the paint job isn't 100% accurate. The next paint was Tamiya's X3. As expected, the airflow of the airbrush lifted the masks. I tried to counter that by spraying at an angle over the masks. That kind of worked, but overall the paint job wasn't all that good. I went over the light blue areas again before and that just didn't work out. Therefore I masked off the dark blue areas again and sprayed on another coat of the light blue. The result was more satisfying, so I moved on to painting the underside of the Rafale. For that I used light coats of mauve mixed steel. The upper side of the canards was also masked and painted. The result after removing the masks here was quite nice, so I found my motivation again and moved on. The next masking phase for the grey areas also needed a lot of time and effort. As you can see, the front section as well as smaller areas like the pylons on the wingtips and the upper part of the vertical stabilizer had to be painted. I used FS36293 Fog Grey for that. The result looked quite good to me. However, after having another look at reference photos, I decided that the light blue still looked wrong. Therefore I went back and masked off everything for the third time. Luckily I still had all the necessary masks. For some areas I also used liquid mask because it's easy and fast to use. Again, the adhesiveness of the Syhart masks wasn't sufficient in some areas, so I also used liquid mask there. As you can tell, this was my last effort. I was close to giving up, but on the other hand I knew how good this scheme looks and I really wanted to pull it off. The previous paint job definitely had its flaws, besides the color. Therefore I also sanded down the surface in some areas before painting. In my opinion, the X4 suggested by the manual was too dark, so I added a couple of drops of white. I airbrushed a few coats of this mixture, but still wasn't satisfied with the saturation. The only other suitable blue paint I had was number 52 from the Rafale Aqua range. After a thin coat of that, I removed the masks for the last time. Even though it's still not perfect, I was finally satisfied with the contrast between the two blue tones and moved on to painting details. For example, I used clear green and red for the position lights. Most of the detail painting was too difficult to film, however, but I used my reference pictures to add as many details as possible. The next step were the engine nacelles. I painted them in metallic colors and added a black wash to tone them down. Syhart also provides these rivets for the individual pedals as decals, which is great. Here I already noticed that the syhart decals are a bit thinner and thus more fragile than most decals I had worked with before. In contrast to the upper side where you have to use masks and decals, the pattern on the underside consists of decals only. I started at one of the wing tips and worked my way across the wings and fuselage. Overall, the decals were quite thin and fragile, and you have to work very precisely. Every slightly misaligned decal would lead to bigger problems later because they are all connected to each other to form this pattern. Here in the middle of the fuselage I had a few problems to align the Rafale insignia. If you want to do a scheme like that, I would recommend adding a few drops of water on the model so you can still move the decals around. Otherwise you might rip them apart. After all the decals were in place, I used the spare decal to cover any gaps and other areas, like these connecting points for the pylons. The decals on the underside of the model took me about 4 to 5 hours total, and I needed a lot of setting solutions. I continued with these lines on the nose of the Rafale. Even though I had used the masks to paint this area, the decals showed that the metallic area was too small. The dark blue decals should be exactly on the border between the grey and metallic part. So either the masks or the decals are wrong. Later on I just brush painted the silver area again. Another problem occurred on the vertical stabilizer where this antenna goes right through this decal. Therefore I cut the decal into several parts on the other side. It's really important to carefully check the manual parts and decals for such things before running into problems. Anyways, it worked quite well here, so I moved on to the large silver decals. I placed the largest one where the wing joins the fuselage and carefully removed the water underneath with a cotton bud. I repeated this process with all the other decals, always paying a lot of attention to the perfect alignment between them. Luckily I was right about the dark blue area. All of its edges are covered with decals, so it was no problem that the masks did not adhere to the surface here. Besides those larger decals, there were also a ton of tiny decals for the hatches, etc. As I said, I covered the decals with setting solution several times, so that they adhered to all the panel lines and details on the surface. When all the decals were on the model, I tried to correct all the mistakes caused by me or the masks, always checking photos of the real solo display Rafale. Then I also did a bit of weathering on the underside, again referring to photos of the real counterpart. I decided not to do any further weathering or washes because that would have been unrealistic in this case. Next I assembled the landing gear. My initial plan was to build this model in flight with the landing gear up, but because of the detailed cockpit I decided against this in the end. Therefore I tried to add a bit of detail by adding small wires and resemble hydraulic lines. Of course that was very fiddly, but why not? The solo display aircraft often carry these Smokewinders, so I took 2 of the magic air-to-air missiles and converted them. For that I just removed some material and sanded it down. They are a bit shorter than their real counterparts, but better than nothing. Something else that the Syhart set comes with are masks for the anti-skid zones. I placed these masks next to the canopy. Then I airbrushed a matte varnish on it. When that was dry, I removed the masks again and the effect is quite subtle and nice. Then it was time to finally remove the kitchen paper from the canopy. As you can see, it had been in there for quite some time and therefore pretty difficult to remove. I had to repaint a few small areas, but overall everything had been protected. Now all that was left to do was adding the clear parts. First I glued the head-up display into place. As you can see, I also painted it with Tamiya's clear green. Last but not least, I unmasked the canopy frames. There were still a few PE parts that I had to glue on and paint. The canopy was left open because I did not want to block the view on the detailed instruments and seats. Overall, I'm very happy that I did not give up, even though this was one of the most difficult models I've built so far. The HobbyBoss kit of the Rafale is quite good, with only a few gaps to fill and a couple of mistakes in the manual. Also, there are some sensors and antennas that the C version of the Rafale does not have, so I would recommend doing some research if you want to achieve a very realistic result. But don't get me wrong, I would build this kit again and it was also better than the Rafale kit. By the way, here you can see the evolution in my modeling skills over the last 5 years. The Rafale was one of the first kits I built and I think I can get rid of it now. A short word on the Eduard photo-etched parts. In contrast to what I read online about people having problems with PE parts, I quite enjoyed using them. I think if you are careful, patient and precise, they can add a lot of detail to a model and I will definitely use them again in the future. Now to the Syhart masks and decals. While using them, I honestly wasn't that impressed. One major gripe with the masks was that they just did not adhere very well. In the end that did not really matter because most borders between the colors are covered with decals anyways. The decals are of high quality, but you need to be very careful while handling them. I had the impression that they are thinner and more fragile than most decals I had used before. Now that the Rafale is finished, my first impression changed to the positive. Even though I had some issues with the Syhart set, I think the final outcome speaks for itself. So if they release more special schemes for the Rafale that I like, I might even think about building another one. What you can't see in my videos are all the hours and hours I put into editing these videos and photos. For this relatively short build review video, for example, I had to edit almost 4 hours of video footage. I personally don't like watching long videos, so I spent many nights on video editing. For me, a condensed video showing only the most important steps in the building and painting process is ideal. Lately my models get more complex, I try new techniques and special schemes like this one, so the videos also get a bit longer. If you came that far in the video, tell me your opinion about video length in the comments below. As always, it would be great to hear your opinion about the Rafale. What can be done better? Did you build something similar? Or do you plan to build something like that? Also check out the links in the description for my other channels and how to support me. Unfortunately, I don't have any sponsors for all the kits, tools, paints, masks and decals used in my videos, so it would be great if you spread the word and support my small channel. More photos of the Rafale can be found on my ScaleMates Instagram and Facebook accounts. So that's all for this pretty long video. Thank you for watching, leave me your feedback and bye!